She is a rising star. It's quite something to behold, actually. I hope that she continues to be a rising star for the Republican Party, at least. I think it's incredibly derogatory to accuse nearly 80 million Americans of mental illness. The last time I checked, Jasmine Crockett couldn't dream of winning such a majority of the public as President Trump did. And the America First movement, which President Trump has built, is filled of hardworking patriots, the forgotten men and women, business owners, law enforcement officers, nurses and teachers, and middle America, as we all know, from where you all grew up, outside of this beltway. That's who makes up this president's movement. And Jasmine Crockett should go to a Trump rally sometime, and she can see it.
And starts talking about somebody's bleach blonde, bad built butch body, that would not be engaging in personalities, correct?
A what now?
Chairman, I make a motion to strike those words.
I don't think that's a part
I'm
of it.
trying to find clarification on what quality.
Chairman, motion to...
No one in that room expected the moment to matter. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't announced, and for a few seconds, it didn't even look important. But it was. Because sometimes, the moment that changes everything doesn't come with a raised voice or a dramatic interruption. Sometimes, it slips out quietly. And by the time people realize what was said, it's already too late to take it back. The hearing had already gone on longer than expected. Papers were stacked unevenly across desks. Staffers leaned back in their chairs, half listening, half waiting for it to end. Cameras remained fixed, streaming live, capturing everything without pause. It looked like any other routine congressional exchange. Until one sentence changed the atmosphere in the room. Not loudly, not clearly at first, but clearly enough. A brief comment, directed, dismissive, meant to stay private. It didn't. And the person it was aimed at didn't react the way anyone expected. There was no interruption, no visible frustration, no attempt to correct the moment, just stillness. And that stillness is what made people start paying attention. Because what didn't happen right away mattered more than what did. And the longer that silence lasted, the heavier the room became. The session had started hours earlier, with a tone that was, at least on the surface, controlled. Policy language, prepared remarks, carefully structured disagreements, the kind of environment where everyone speaks, but very little is actually said. At one end of the panel sat Jasmine Crockett, composed, observant, saying little, not disengaged, just measured. Across from her was Karoline Levitt, leaning forward more often, speaking more frequently, carrying a tone that suggested certainty. It was the kind of dynamic that isn't unusual in rooms like this. One voice steady and deliberate, the other more immediate, more assertive. Neither new to pressure. But something about the exchange that day felt slightly misaligned. Not obvious, not enough for anyone to comment on, but enough to be felt. Small interruptions began to overlap. Responses came a little quicker, a little sharper. Words were still professional, but the space between them was tightening. Jasmine didn't rush to respond. She listened. She took notes. She waited. And that waiting started to stand out. Because in a setting where people often compete to speak, choosing not to can feel almost out of place. Karoline, on the other hand, didn't slow down. Her responses came with confidence, direct, unhesitating, and in a room that rewards certainty. That usually works. Until it doesn't. The exchange itself didn't begin with conflict. It began with a question. Simple, direct, delivered without emotion. Jasmine finally leaned slightly forward, her voice calm. Not raised, not confrontational, just clear. A question about consistency, about standards, about who those standards actually apply to and who they don't. The kind of question that doesn't demand a reaction, but invites one. Karoline responded immediately. Confident, structured, familiar talking points. On the surface, nothing unusual. But something underneath had shifted. Because this wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about framing. And framing, in rooms like this, is everything. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't push. She simply added one more line. Measured. precise, and just uncomfortable enough to linger. That's when it happened. Karoline leaned slightly to the side, not toward the microphone, not intending to be heard. Just enough movement to suggest the conversation had, for a second, moved off stage. And then, come short, under her breath, but not quiet enough. The microphone didn't hesitate. It carried the words across the room the same way it carried everything else. Flat, unfiltered, immediate. At first, nothing changed. No one moved. No one reacted. Because not everyone processed it at the same time. But then, a shift. Subtle. A pause that didn't belong. Someone stopped writing. A staffer looked up. A chair creaked in the back row. And slowly, awareness began to spread. Not loudly, but unmistakably. And in that moment, everyone understood the same thing at once. That wasn't supposed to be heard, but it was. And now, there was no way to take it back. What happened next wasn't immediate. There was no interruption from the chair, no formal acknowledgement, no sudden shift in procedure, just a brief attempt to continue, as if nothing had happened. But something had, and the room knew it. Karoline adjusted her posture slightly, reached for her notes, maintained composure, but not perfectly. There was a delay now, a fraction of a second before each movement. The kind of delay that only shows up when someone realizes, too late. Across from her, Jasmine didn't move, not right away. No visible reaction, no expression of offense, no effort to respond. Just stillness. And then, she looked up, not sharply, not dramatically, just directly. It wasn't a look of confrontation. It wasn't even a look of surprise. It was something quieter, something more controlled. The kind of look that doesn't escalate a moment, but holds it in place. And for a second, that was enough, because the room wasn't waiting for words anymore. It was waiting to see what she would do. Would she interrupt? Address it immediately? Force the issue into the open? She didn't. Instead, she did something far less expected. She looked down, picked up her pen, and wrote something on her notepad. One line. No hesitation. No visible emotion. And then, she waited again. That decision changed the direction of everything that followed, because by not reacting, she removed the option for anyone else to control the moment. And just like that, the pressure didn't disappear. It shifted. The hearing continued. Technically, words were still being spoken. Questions were still being asked. But the rhythm had changed. Something invisible had entered the room, and no one could ignore it. Even the smallest sounds started to feel louder. Paper moving, a pen tapping, a chair adjusting. All of it carried weight now, because everyone was aware of the same thing. Something had been said, and it hadn't been addressed. Karoline continued speaking when called on, but the certainty in her tone wasn't landing the same way anymore. There was a slight hesitation now, almost unnoticeable, but present. And in rooms like this, those small shifts are everything. Jasmine still didn't respond. Not directly. Not yet. She allowed the session to move forward. Let others speak. Let the structure remain intact. But her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. And the longer it lasted, the more attention it drew. Because silence, in the right moment, doesn't reduce tension. It concentrates it. By the time the session approached its closing segment, people weren't just listening to what was being said. They were waiting. Waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. And the longer it didn't happen, the more certain it became. When it did, it would matter. The hearing ended without resolution. No direct acknowledgement. No interruption recorded in the official tone of the session. On paper, it looked complete, orderly, routine. But outside the room, it didn't stay that way. Because in a space where everything is recorded, nothing stays contained for long. It started quietly. A clipped segment, 30 seconds, then 20, zoomed slightly, slowed just enough to remove doubt. The audio was clear. Not perfect, but clear enough. And clarity is all something like this needs. Within minutes, the footage began moving. Not through official channels at first, through phones, through messages, through people who had been in the room, sending it to people who weren't. And then, it reached the public stream. Once it did, the pace changed. Because the moment was no longer part of a hearing. It became a question. What was said? Was it intentional? And, more importantly, what happens now? The clip didn't need commentary. It carried its own weight. And that weight began to spread, faster than any formal response could keep up with. By the time staff began exiting the building, the narrative was already forming. Not officially, but visibly. Phones were out. Messages were being drafted before statements were approved. And in environments like this, speed matters. Because the first version people see often becomes the version they believe. Karoline moved quickly through the hallway, composed, focused forward. But the space around her had changed. Conversations paused as she passed. Not loudly, but noticeably. An aide stepped closer, speaking in a lower tone. Not urgent, but direct. There was no time to wait. A response needed to exist. Immediately. But the problem wasn't just what had been said. It was how clearly it had been heard. Because ambiguity can be managed. Clarity cannot. Inside a closed office, the discussion wasn't about whether to respond. It was about how. Was it misinterpreted? Was it incomplete? Could it be reframed? Each option carried risk. And the more they spoke, the more one reality became difficult to avoid. This wasn't going to disappear on its own. Across the building, Jasmine wasn't surrounded. She didn't stop for questions, didn't engage with the early reactions. She moved at the same pace she always did. No visible change, no indication that anything had shifted. But something had, and the absence of reaction was becoming its own form of response. By evening, the moment had fully transitioned. It was no longer just a clip. It was a conversation, not controlled by one side, not guided by a single narrative, but expanding. Different interpretations, different reactions, all anchored to the same few seconds. Some focused on the words, others focused on the response, or lack of one. Because what Jasmine didn't do was starting to stand out more than what had been done to her. She hadn't interrupted, hadn't escalated, hadn't responded in real time. And in a media environment built on immediate reaction, that restraint created uncertainty. Was she going to respond later? Was she choosing not to respond at all? Or was she waiting for something else? That question kept people watching, because unresolved moments create attention, and attention, when sustained, creates pressure. Karoline's team released a statement late in the evening, carefully structured, measured language, referencing misunderstanding, referencing context, referencing intention. But avoiding confirmation, it was designed to stabilize, to reduce momentum, but the timing worked against it, because by the time it was released, the moment had already moved beyond explanation. People weren't just reacting to the statement, they were comparing it to what they had already heard, and the gap between the two was becoming harder to close. The following morning didn't start loudly. No major announcement, no scheduled response. But the environment had shifted. The building felt different, not chaotic, just aware. Because everyone understood this wasn't finished. Reporters gathered earlier than usual, not chasing a statement, waiting for one, because the absence of response had now lasted long enough to create expectation. And expectation is where pressure builds. At exactly 10 a.m., movement at the press area shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. Jasmine stepped forward, alone. No group, no visible preparation team, just a folder in her hand, closed. She placed it on the podium, looked down briefly, then back up. No rush, no attempt to control the room. She didn't need to, because the room was already focused, waiting for what she would say, or what she wouldn't. She began without introduction. No acknowledgement of the previous day, No reference to the clip, at least, not directly. "I had something prepared," she said, her tone steady, controlled. "But I don't think I need it." She rested her hand lightly on the folder, didn't open it. That alone shifted the room, because prepared remarks suggest structure. But this was something else. She paused. Not long, just enough. Then continued. "What happened yesterday?" Another pause. Not for effect, for precision. Wasn't unfamiliar. The wording was deliberate, not emotional, not reactive, but impossible to ignore. She didn't repeat the words that had been said, didn't elevate them, didn't give them more space. Instead, she reframed the moment, from an incident to a pattern. And in doing that, she changed what the audience was listening for. This wasn't about one sentence anymore. It was about something larger, something ongoing. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accelerate her pace. She spoke the same way she had sat the day before, composed, measured, certain. And then, she delivered the line that shifted everything. "I'm not going anywhere." No emphasis, no repetition, just a statement, clear, final. And in that moment, the balance changed. Because she hadn't reacted to the comment, she had positioned herself beyond it. And that removed its power. For a brief moment after she finished speaking, nothing happened. No question, no interruption, no movement toward the podium. Just silence. The kind that doesn't come from confusion, but from recognition. Because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. She hadn't argued. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't even repeated the words that had been said to her. And yet, she had answered them completely. The cameras kept rolling. Producers in control rooms didn't cut away. They held the shot. Because they knew this was the moment. Not the hearing. Not the comment. This. Within seconds, the clip began moving, faster than the one from the day before. Because this time, there was no ambiguity. No need to replay or analyze what was said. It was already clear. The line carried on its own. "I'm not going anywhere." Short, direct, uncomplicated, and impossible to misinterpret. Across networks, the same segment played repeatedly. Not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. Because in an environment built on reaction, restraint stood out, and viewers noticed. Not just what she said, but how she said it. By midday, the narrative had shifted. Not entirely, but enough. The focus was no longer centered on the comment alone. It had moved to the response, to the contrast, to the difference between what was said and how it was handled. Karoline's earlier statement began to circulate again, but this time, it was being viewed alongside Jasmine's remarks, side by side, measured against each other. And in that comparison, something became clear. One was trying to manage the moment. The other had already moved past it. Inside private offices, conversations changed tone. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about position. Because in situations like this, who controls the narrative determines what comes next. Karoline remained out of view. No immediate follow-up appearance. No direct response to the press conference. But the absence felt different now. Less strategic, more constrained. Because responding after that kind of statement carried risk. Any attempt to reframe would be compared. Any attempt to challenge would be measured. And, in that environment, certainty becomes harder to maintain. Outside of Washington, the reaction followed a different pattern. Slower, but deeper. Because the moment didn't rely on political alignment. It didn't require context. It didn't need explanation. It translated easily into conversations, into personal interpretation, into recognition. In workplaces, people replayed the clip quietly, not discussing policy, not debating intent, just observing the tone, the pacing, the decision not to escalate. And that decision began to resonate because it wasn't common, not in public settings, not under pressure, not when a response is expected immediately. What people saw wasn't just a reply. It was control. Not over the other person, but over the moment itself. And that kind of control doesn't go unnoticed. In the days that followed, the intensity didn't disappear. It changed form. The headlines moved on. The cycle continued. But the moment remained. Referenced, revisited, replayed in quieter discussions. Because it didn't resolve in a dramatic way. There was no confrontation. No formal conclusion. No definitive closure. And because of that, it stayed open. Not as an unresolved issue, but as an example of how something could be handled differently. Inside legislative spaces, the dynamic subtly adjusted. Not visibly. Not in ways that could be easily documented, but in tone, in pacing, in awareness. Because once a moment like that happens, it creates a reference point. Something people remember, not for what was said, but for how it was answered. Karoline's presence became more measured, more contained. Fewer public engagements, more controlled appearances. Not absent, but adjusted. Because the margin for error had narrowed, and the awareness of that margin had increased. Jasmine, on the other hand, didn't expand outward, didn't capitalize publicly, didn't repeat the line, or build on it. She returned to the same pattern she had before. Measured, deliberate, consistent, which, in itself, reinforced the moment, because it proved. It hadn't been performance. It had been alignment. There was no final confrontation, no follow-up exchange between them, no moment where everything was directly addressed, face to face, and in another kind of story that might feel incomplete. But here, it didn't, because the outcome wasn't determined by who spoke last. It was determined by how the moment was carried. One comment, unintended for the microphone, but captured anyway. One response, not immediate, not reactive, but deliberate. And in between those 2 points, the balance shifted, not through volume, not through escalation, but through restraint, because sometimes the most decisive response isn't the fastest one. It's the one that waits, the one that allows the moment to fully exist before stepping into it. And when it finally does, it doesn't need to be repeated. It doesn't need to be explained. It simply stays, not as noise, but as something quieter, something heavier, something that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off. And long after the clip stops circulating, long after the headlines move on, that's the part people remember. Not the words that were said in passing, but the choice that followed them, the pause, the control, the refusal to be pulled into something smaller. Because in the end, power didn't come from the comment. It came from the response that didn't rush to meet it.